Welcome, everybody, back to a new episode of the Tool Belt podcast brought to you by Plant Services. Today, we have a special guest with us. It's Rick Kaun from Verve Industrial, and he's here to talk with us about how IT and OT is converging and how the convergence of those worlds can help you and your teams better monitor your critical assets. So, Rick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Thomas. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, as I said, about my favorite subject. So looking forward to sharing with you and your readers today.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into the questions about the topic, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in the convergence of these two worlds?
Sure. So in 2001, about 20 years ago, I started in the IT department at a company called Matricon, which many of your listeners, readers may have heard. Back in the day, was one of the biggest developers of OPC drivers. And for me, that was the emergence of, IT trying to get into OT, bringing visibility to monitoring and process improvement and loop tuning, et cetera. And my department I was asked to set up a department that was tasked with safeguarding the infrastructure that we're going into. So as we went into trying to improve our visibility, we weren't decreasing the security or the reliability of the environment. So we built a services-based organization that we started to grow. It was shortly after we started to see some NERC-CIP type of function and traction. Fast forward to today, Matricon got bought by a company called Honeywell, which of course more people have probably heard of than Matricon. And I liked the opportunity to work in large, global, complex clients, which was very interesting for my own, resume and learning, et cetera. But I found that Honeywell was a little bit difficult given its size. And so I joined a vendor neutral, smaller company. Again, the reason I like that is when I work with a facility, there's more than one label or OEM vendor in that space. And so if you could bring a holistic view to this environment, you're doing much better service, in my opinion, to the end user, helping to understand all the different nuances of security within an environment, regardless of the OEM label. So I work now for Verve. We are actually originally a systems integrator company. We do a lot of DCS programming, PLC upgrades, a lot of historian work for loop tuning and some of those process improvement and monitoring capabilities. And along the way, we've built a security platform as well. So I like to think that in the last 20 years, I've done a few projects on security projects and maybe can share some hangups and some obstacles that some of your fellowship might encounter and ways to maybe avoid them.
Yeah, and from what we hear from our readers, they're encountering a lot of these issues. You're right. You put your finger on one of the problems they're experiencing, which is just the sheer variety of asset classes they're asked to manage and the sheer variety of vendors who manufacture those assets. There's not always time to make sure you can get the same equipment from the same vendor in order to build out a production line. And it's a challenge to get all the assets to work together, much less work together securely.
Yeah, no, and back to my day as an OEM vendor trying to bid projects, unless security is written in the spec, your vendor's not going to bake it into the product because it costs more. And when they want minimum compliant and maximum margin, you're not putting anything optional there. So often these things are built without security or with minimal security. And we're getting better. I remember once upon a time I was dispatched to a OSB mill because the vendor decided that a BGP packet, for example, was a great starting point for their new plug and play tool set. As soon as it hit a smart 3-com switch, which knew what BGP was, nothing got through. So I had to make both sides as dumb as possible to make that work. So we're using new technology, but not necessarily the way it's intended sometimes.
Wow. Well, let me ask you about responsibilities among plant teams for these kind of functions. Our readers some are learning to have these conversations. Some are have more dexterity with these conversations. But I think there's an open question in a lot of ways on how security responsibilities should be divided up between the OT and the IT teams. I mean, our readers often report up through the operations function, maintenance reliability, especially if not a couple of operators themselves. So they're curious to hear your thoughts. What are these teams on the hook for security, or what do you see people on the hook for? And what would you say they should let IT take care of or ask them to take care of?
It's different for every single organization, depending on how mature IT is, how much collaboration there is between the two departments. But if I stick to a purely philosophical perspective, maybe that might help. As we discussed, as we're getting ready for the podcast and preparing for what we wanted to talk today, we talked about the notion that cybersecurity in OT isn't necessarily around honeypots and catching the bad guy and doing the stuff we see in the movies, like tracing back to, the evil guys. The reality is we want to keep safe, reliable, expected operation running as much as possible. And so the ultimate responsibility for me, in my opinion, and many of our clients for the decision making lies with operations, with maintenance, with the entire, what we call the OT team. Now, the challenge there is that we need to have this knowledge and awareness of the tool sets on the IT side for pure security things. And let's face it, you could pick an entire career just on networking or just on email or just on databases. And so there's too much for any one person to know. And so I can't have someone with all operational and all security knowledge. I will take a team, right? And so what we advocate is what we call a think global and act local. And what that means is if you do it right, a small team of, a few IT and a few OT can work together to first assess risk. If Bluekeep comes out, for example, we can drop that into our database. We can see exactly where that lights us up, but then you need the OT context, right? I can't simply say it's a critical risk on 400 assets. I need the OT site. I need the OT guy or an OT tool set to say, okay, here's everywhere that it is. But within these assets, some of these are critical to safe operations. It's a safety system. Maybe it's a lab information management system. Maybe it's something that's working on product spec or safety system. Those are going to have a very different priority, but also a handling than redundant, corporate domain controllers in the DMZ. So right there, I can tell you that same Bluekeep risk has different context for me in an operations role on one versus the other. Where am I going to test first? What am I going to start with? And the only way to come up with smart decisions like that is you first have to have the context. And I challenge my OT readers and followers and that are listening to this. Inventory is not just IP and MAC address. It's everything about that device, plus its operational context. You take that context and you then work with IT and say, okay, what's this Bluekeep all about? I need to do this as an example, carrying on the analogy. What's this Bluekeep all about? Well, I can't necessarily apply the patch because either the vendor hasn't approved it yet or they've looked at it and they don't approve it. What we need to do in OT, which is the hallmark of anything, is what I call compensating controls. So if I can't apply the patch, what is my plan B, C, or D? And if the IT guy that's read the vulnerability can tell me, well, just disable remote desktop or the guest account in as many places as possible, we as an organization have now gone and said, okay, rather than raw risk indicator, we've taken a notice and we've understood it through this combination of IT and OT. And we're now going to provide at least compensating controls to most of our systems and full patch where possible. I've done what I always claim for IT people. I will get the OT guys there as close as I can and as fast as we can, but we may take a different path to get there. That's really the only way to have meaningful risk reduction and sustainable sort of collaborative environment.
Okay. Well, I'm curious to know, Rick, you mentioned that these teams often share the process of assessing the risk in the first place and building out that plan. Are there other areas of overlap that you've noticed where the teams would share responsibilities, such as either for proving out the ROI on these kind of investments?
Where I'd like to see more, and I don't see as much, but the forward-looking ones are when we get into proactive maintenance, right? So we had a client where IT went away and came up with a list of system hardening things they'd like to see in all their systems, and we're going to throw that into group policy and just let it turn on. And of course, that scares the crap out of every operator everywhere. Small things that they aren't aware on the IT side, like a banner login. Well, if you're at a pipeline or a transmission line, an auto reboot with an auto login in case that goes offline is a fundamental need, or else somebody has to be physically dispatched to this distant thing in a skidoo or a quad out in the middle of nowhere. So those proactive things, whether that's the specific security controls. So the one I gave before was a risk has emerged, let's all assess it together. Now let's go and be proactive. What can we actually do to minimize our attack surface? What can we do? The other thing we talked about in our preamble, what can we do to start to write security into our spec? When I go to do an upgrade, if I'm still getting equipment that requires me to go backward compatible to Windows 7, I'm not doing my company any favors, right? Now, a big rip and replace, heavy lift to completely change your vendor label, not necessarily reasonable either. But those proactive things where either IT goes and says, oh, we're going to do vulnerability scanning here, or OT says, well, we're going to stick with our current vendor. I need Windows 7 boxes. We're missing the opportunity to do that collaborative sort of cooperation there, multiple forward-looking things, as well as reactive as risks emerge.
We scheduled this conversation to talk about ITOT specifically as a network strategy. And, in the 7 years that I've been with Plant Services, it has gone from being an emerging strategy to something which is being deployed day to day. So you alluded before when we started here to some of the things that you're hearing from plants and teams that you work with. What are some of the things that you can share with our readers on what the reality of IT-OT convergence looks like on a day-to-day level?
Yeah, great question. Everybody does it to differing levels of success. The ones that do it right are using, like I said, this think global, act local sort of perspective. So for example, we have a manufacturing client. Obviously they're our clients, so they put our technology in, but the result from that was they were able to see all of their risk, right? Everything that they thought they may or may not have had. For example, they found 5 systems that were dual homed around the firewall, right? So we see violations to their network architecture. On those 5, 4 of them are running TeamViewer. So they were bypassing a remote access sort of policy and expectation. They did find a whole bunch of things not patched for not patch or WannaCry, but they also found a whole bunch of exploitable firmware on PLC levels, et cetera. That particular organization took that and said, this is our new standard. We're going to put this into plant number 1, and they have 50 or 60 of them in different levels of criticality. And what they do as a team is they put it in, and then they go and take the results and say, here's our plan. Let's work together to build what we're doing day 1 versus month 1 versus year 1, and sort of build sort of a standard. Then that same standard goes to the next plant, and eventually they're building this corporate collaborative environment. It's wonderful. I can't say enough about it. But what I think the real challenges are in the environments that don't do it well. We have another client where the CISO is, I shall do what I need to do, and I have enough work to do on the IT side that we'll get to OT later. And there's 2 things wrong with that. Number 1, OT is being left behind. And number 2, if I make a decision on the IT side and 18 months later, I now go to try and take it to OT, I'm pretty baked in with that solution. And if it doesn't work on the OT side, I'm either going back to the drawing board or I'm only doing half the job. And so what I would implore your team to do is, or your listeners to do, is to say, look, you need to fight for that seat at the table, not because you're going to take over running whitelisting tools or an SOC, but because you have very specific requirements that can or can't happen when IT makes those decisions. And IT, for the most part, they're not doing it out of malice. They're doing it arguably out of ignorance, right? I can't tell you the number of times I've sat with a big 4 OT specialist and said, you can't do scan-based vulnerabilities in OT. You just don't. You knock stuff off. And so you're going to miss systems, or you're going to miss openings or opportunities. So let's get a vulnerability plan that matches the corporate's requirement, but let's not put the tool first and hope that we can come back later and retrofit it to OT. So that I guess to answer your question, we need to have a louder voice. We need to say, look, I'm on board. I want to get where you need to, but you need to believe me that we need to take a different path or maybe use different tool sets.
Yeah, and we've heard that's a challenge too, because a lot of people on the OT side may not have the similar vocabulary that IT would expect out of them. In some ways, it's different worlds, different goals. Even though the goal of each department is to help make money for the company, they've got different missions to go about doing that. One is, on the OT side, it's asset care, asset operation. On the IT side, it's make sure the systems are maintained.
If I may just expand on that a little bit, Thomas,
Sure.
The other thing that I see as a real challenge is that in IT, the trend generally is that for any size or shape of organization that's more than 1 or 2 people in IT, that there's a lot of specialization within IT, right? So that the guy who does the vulnerability analysis throws it over the fence, and then somebody who does vulnerability management or risk reduction is a different department. And so the other thing I implore all of my OT brethren is to say, look, if you can get somebody on your budget, and not somebody that's on the side of their desk, that is your advocate, that goes to the network team, that also goes to the endpoint team, that also gets to go to the CISO or whatever, and acts as that advocate on your behalf for all things operation, they're able to navigate those otherwise silos of information. And I find that's a huge challenge in trying to get things done in OT. Again, because of that compensating control, I may not be able to patch, but I need to know that I can do these other compensating controls. So when the risk guy comes, I can say, oh yeah, I've got this many of them and here's what we've done.
Mhm.
But that in the IT side would span multiple divisions. On the OT side, we don't have that luxury. But if we could at least dedicate somebody who is responsible as that advocate on behalf of operations to navigate amongst the different departments, we'd have a much better success rate. We're seeing it actually with a very formal client that has a very formal corporate HQ and a full DMC and everything comes into it. They're bringing business unit by business unit into it. And we are having an advocate as the consultant. We are the advocate on behalf of the different business units because I've already talked to the network guy. I've already talked to the infrastructure guy. I've already talked because we did it with business unit 1. And so I've learned now how to navigate those. And if we can leave that knowledge behind, that operating entity will be much more successful in the maintenance portion once the project's over.
That's really interesting. And I want to go back to something you said about the way that IT teams have a lot of specialization in them, because in some ways that's not so dissimilar from maintenance and reliability teams. You may have a vibration specialist on hand to monitor the motors. You might have a thermal technician who's in charge of electrical panel maintenance, that sort of thing. And yet, each department can look monolithic to the others. So I'm just bringing it up as a possible point of sympathy between the two teams, that you may appear to be a monolith, but each side has specializations, and the more one learns about the other, the more they can appreciate, okay, what are the data demands on the reliability side, and how might this specialist in IT help out with that problem?
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that goes both ways. I'd advocate on the OT side, and I do it from the OT side because I'm biased. I have seen organizations where IT is designated an OT outreach person. But in both cases, it helps to navigate multiple divisions on both sides. You're absolutely right. If I come in and say, I'm the OT advocate and we're going to do something around vulnerability scanning or something alternative to vulnerability scanning, I'm going to need to know my options from IT. And then I'm going to need to say, okay, well, now you need to explain it to the vibration guys. You need to explain it to the operators. You need to explain it to, because they're all going to have different needs because they all have different systems. You're absolutely right.
Well, let me close the conversation then, Rick, with a question on partnerships. And I bring this up especially because you have been involved with a bunch of different companies. As you said in your background, you've seen these situations from various perspectives. Right now you're with Verve, which is an IT partner, ITOT partner. When you meet plant teams, how many at least initially think they can do it on their own and don't realize that a partner can help, versus how many are already down the path and are mature enough in what they understand about the job to say, okay, we know we need partners for A, B, C areas? And who owns those conversations?
To be honest, most of the operators I talk to realize they don't have the staff and maybe don't have the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
What the challenge is for them is that there's so much noise in the space. There are literally hundreds of millions of dollars from venture capital being put into different marketing and new technologies and promises that, I've been in this for 20 years. I've seen the silver bullet come not once, but twice. And in both cases, it's never lived up to its hype. And so the challenge for many of these organizations is in recognizing, well, I think they recognize that they need to do something. They're not necessarily sure what it is they need to do, right? And so getting some experience on what to do or how fast to do it or what makes the most sense from the vendor community, from other peers, from these industry trade shows. The ICSJWG and the Public Safety Canada for North America are two federally run, information sharing and, trade show type things. Because they're federally run, there's not, you can't buy your way onto the podium. You have to have a good topic if you're a vendor. You have to pay, stand at the booth, et cetera. They're great places to learn and kick the tires. What everybody fails, IT, OT, everywhere, fails to realize is the maintenance portion. I can't just go do something and hope it's good. We had a client, I worked for a previous company. We did some work with them. We did a walk down on inventory. I left and I worked for Verve. I go back to that client. They need help again. 4 years later, we're doing an inventory again because nobody touched it for 4 years, right? And it's off by 592% because of the explosion in IoT. So nobody understands the maintenance. And so I know I work for a vendor. I'm often painted with the sales brush. Yeah, but you know what? In my 20 years, I've been everywhere from Saudi Aramco headquarters to mom and pop pulp and paper in the middle of nowhere. I've seen what does or doesn't work. You don't have to take my stuff, but you probably should at least ask me the questions because you're doing it for the first time once. I've seen it literally 300 times, right? I'm not trying to sell you. I'm trying to help you. And if you do use my stuff, great. If not, at least we've made the world a better place, because, I wonder what's going to be the final impetus. We're seeing the TSA with the new directive around pipelines, and my inbox is lighting up with pipeline customers saying, whoa, can you help? We have 90 days. I'm encouraged because we're going to make some progress, but I'm discouraged that it takes that level of, big giant stick to get people moving, right? It's not as hard as it looks. It's not trivial, right? I've spent 25 years drinking beer and eating wings. I'm not going to get fit by next weekend, right? Just by jumping on a treadmill 3 times. So there's a little bit of work to be done, but we don't need to be afraid of it. We can make it manageable and sustainable. And there are lots of good opportunities and ideas out there. We just need to, be not so afraid of that divide between IT and OT. I think there's a very productive future, but to bring it back to the theme, IT and OT both have to be at the table, and OT has to say, here's what operationally or functionally needs to happen. And IT says, well, here are your options within those parameters. That's the only way for us to succeed.
Wow. Well, Rick, I want to thank you for the conversation. And on behalf of all the maintenance folks who pumped their fists when you mentioned that maintenance gets overlooked, I also want to thank you on their behalf. It's a team which it's a team that often gets information at the very last minute, and your knowledge today is going to help them get more out in front of, especially these ITOT conversations. So thank you.
I see my job as part advocate and evangelist. And so anytime I get an opportunity to share what we've learned the hard way so that hopefully somebody avoids the hard lessons, then it's absolutely worth the time. I appreciate the opportunity.
Wow. Well, and for everyone listening, we'll put information and a link to Verve Industrial in the podcast notes. So once again, thanks to Verve Industrial, and thanks to Rick Kaun.
Thank you, Thomas.